Chapter 1. Whispers from Troy. The fires of Troy had finally dimmed. Smoke still curled into the morning sky like ancient prayers, soft and grey against the pale light. Odysseus stood apart from the others, his feet sinking slightly into the blackened sand. Behind him, the walls of the once mighty city were now little more than jagged silhouettes, fractured by years of siege and sorrow. The war was over, but peace had not come. Around him, his men gathered what little they could carry plunder. Tools, water, quiet stories shared in tired voices. There were no songs of victory, no celebratory cries. Only the wind, brushing against the broken spears, still standing in the earth. For Odysseus, the silence felt heavier than any battle. He had fought with cunning, not just strength. His mind had shaped victories as much as his sword. But as he stared at the sea, at the shimmering, endless path back to Ithaca, it felt as if the real war was only beginning. The promise of home should have been comforting. It should have been a beacon. Yet now, it felt distant, faded, uncertain. Troy had taken 10 years of his life, years that could not be reclaimed. Behind him were graves marked by stone, by memory, by regret. Friends lost, promises buried. The faces of the fallen haunted him more than the cries of his enemies ever had. He remembered the night he left Ithaca, Penelope watching from the cliffs, Telemachus still too young to understand war or duty, a kiss, a vow, a hope that he would return soon, that the gods would be kind, that the sea would carry him swiftly back. But the sea does not keep promises. As his men prepared the ships, Odysseus ran his fingers through the sand. Grains of ash and earth clung to his skin, as if Troy itself was trying to hold him there. He closed his eyes and listened. The air still hummed with echoes, shouts from long-gone warriors, the clang of bronze, the crackling of fire, whispers from a city that had refused to fall. Until it did. He had outwitted Priam's walls with a horse of silence and trickery. But even victory tasted bitter now. There was no joy in conquest, only the realization of what it cost. The gods had played their parts, Athena with her wisdom, Poseidon with his wrath, Zeus watching from high thrones. Yet even divine favor felt fragile. The gods, like men, were fickle, and Odysseus knew that what they granted, they could also take away. The sails would rise with the sun. The ships, weathered, worn, and barely holding, would glide into open waters. But what lay ahead was unknown. He had maps, yes, and stars to guide him. But the path home was never straight. It twisted through trials, through storms, through choices that would weigh heavily on the soul. His thoughts turned to Penelope. Did she still wait? Did she still dream of him in quiet rooms, spinning tales to their son of a father shaped by courage? Or had time chipped away at her hope, just as it had eroded his certainty? He did not know. He could not know. All he had was the memory of her voice, the warmth of her hands, and the belief that something true waited for him beyond the waves. That morning, as the last embers of Troy faded, Odysseus stood still. Around him, the men finished loading supplies. The tide began to shift. A gull called overhead, circling the masts like an omen. He inhaled deeply, letting the scent of salt and smoke fill his lungs. This was no longer the air of war. It was the air of passage, of transition, of leaving. He stepped onto the plank and walked toward his ship. His men watched him, not with celebration, but with quiet trust. They, too, were tired. They, too, wanted to go home, but none of them knew what the journey would demand. Not yet. The sea waited, not cruel, not kind, simply vast. A mirror to the soul, reflecting back whatever burdens one carried. Odysseus placed a hand on the ship's worn rail and looked once more toward the crumbling city. There would be other wars, other myths, other kings. But Troy was done. Its story closed. As the ship pushed away from shore, the wind caught its sails, billowing them into motion. The oars dipped into the water in rhythm, steady and calm. Behind them, Troy sank slowly into the haze of distance. Before them, the horizon shimmered with promise. Odysseus said nothing. His eyes scanned the waters, already searching for signs, for shifts in current, for the will of the gods hidden in the waves. He did not yet know of the monsters to come, or the islands of temptation, or the voices that would call to him in dreams. But he knew this. He would not stop until he reached Ithaca, until his feet touched the soil of home again. And so the journey began, not in fire or fury, but in silence, in longing, in the quiet truth that some journeys are not about distance, but about becoming. Chapter 2. The Island of the Lotus. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction. Day blurred into day, the sun tracing slow arcs above restless waves. Odysseus stood at the prow, eyes narrowed, seeking land. His crew grew quiet in the stillness, lulled into a rhythm of salt and silence. They had left Troy behind, yet the burden of war clung to their shoulders. Victory had not made them whole. It had only emptied them of purpose. Then came the island low, green and glowing under a hazy sky. Birds circled its shores, and the scent of fruit drifted on the breeze, sweet and strange. There were no storms, no signs of danger, just calm waters and still trees. A haven, or so it seemed. They anchored their ships in a shallow bay and stepped onto soft sand. Flowers grew wild along the coast, petals swaying without wind. The island pulsed with life, yet it spoke in whispers, not roars. It welcomed without warning. The first to greet them were the Lotus Eaters' figures, gentle and smiling, with slow voices and slower movements. They offered no weapons, only food. Baskets of golden fruit, soft as breath and light as air. The men, hungry and weary, accepted. One bite was enough. The lotus worked quietly. It did not burn or sting. It soothed. It softened. Thoughts of home, of wives and children, of the war just past, all began to fade. Time loosened its grip. Names were forgotten. Faces blurred. The sea no longer called. Only rest mattered. Odysseus watched from a distance. He saw the change settle in their eyes. The weight they had carried for years was suddenly gone. But so too was their purpose. They sat beneath trees, laughing softly, staring at nothing in particular. When he asked them to return, they did not answer. When he reminded them of Ithaca, they blinked as if the name had lost all meaning. This was not magic in the way of storms or monsters. It was more subtle, more dangerous. It erased without violence. He walked among them, calling each by name. Still, they smiled, offering fruit instead of answers. The island wanted nothing but their forgetting, and they were willing to give it. He understood the temptation. The war had carved deep wounds. Here, the pain dulled. The lotus offered peace without questions. But peace without memory is not peace, it is surrender. Odysseus knew that. He had dreamed too long of home to let it vanish now. Even comfort must be earned, not borrowed from oblivion. He gathered his strength and went to each man, shaking them, speaking words of the past. He reminded them of wives who waited, sons who grew up without fathers, land that needed tending, homes that whispered in dreams. Some resisted, some wept, some clung to the Lotus like it was life itself. But slowly, one by one, their eyes cleared. The fog of forgetting began to lift. Odysseus dragged them back to the ships, some still dazed, others begging to return. The island remained silent. It did not fight. It simply watched them leave, like a dream slipping away at dawn. As they pulled from shore, the men sat in silence, the taste of the Lotus still lingering on their tongues. It had shown them something they could not unsee, a world without pain, yes, but also without love, without memory, without self. Odysseus stood at the helm, wind in his hair, hands tight on the ropes. The sea welcomed them back with a soft roar, waves rising like breath. That night, they did not speak of the island. Not directly, but they held their memories closer. They looked at the stars with a new kind of reverence. And when sleep came, it came without dreams. The Lotus had tempted them with escape, with the easing of burdens. But Odysseus knew that to forget suffering was also to forget joy. To forget longing was to forget love. The journey home required more than distance. It required remembrance. And so he kept sailing not just to Ithaca, but toward the wholeness that only memory could restore. Chapter 3. The One-Eyed Gatekeeper. The wind had turned playful again, pushing the ships gently across the open sea. The men had begun to laugh more, the scent of the Lotus Island fading with the salt. Hope, fragile but present, began to rise. They reached another land, a wild and rocky place that rose like teeth from the water. Hills rolled into distant cliffs, and smoke curled up from somewhere deeper inland. Odysseus saw caves carved into the rock, dark mouths that promised shelter or something else. The island felt untamed, untouched by the world of men. Yet it drew them in. Hunger pushed them forward. They brought supplies and gifts, as was custom. When they found a large cave near the shore, filled with cheese, milk, and pens of bleating sheep, the men believed fortune had finally smiled on them. They urged Odysseus to take what they needed and leave. But he hesitated. He wanted to see the host, to meet the being who lived in such a place. Curiosity, pride, and perhaps the hope of hospitality won out. They waited, and then he came. A towering figure with one eye in the center of his forehead, a giant of brute strength and dull cruelty. Polyphemus, the Cyclops. His arrival brought silence. He rolled a stone across the entrance of the cave, sealing them in. His voice was thunder wrapped in flesh. He asked no names, offered no welcome. Instead, he asked questions only after crushing bones. 2 men were taken first, devoured without pause. The rest froze in place, the horror of power unbound settling in their chests. Odysseus said nothing at first. His mind raced. Fighting would mean death. Praying would not stop the blood. So he turned to wit. He offered wine, strong and sweet. The Cyclops drank deeply, pleased by the taste. When asked his name, Odysseus smiled carefully and said, "No one," a gift wrapped in misdirection. Polyphemus laughed, his eye drooping with sleep. When the beast finally collapsed into slumber, Odysseus acted. He had sharpened a great stake in secret. With help, he drove it into the Cyclops' eye, twisting as the monster roared, awake, blinded and thrashing. The cave filled with howls. Outside, the other Cyclopes heard and called to him. "Who is hurting you?" they asked, and the answer came, full of rage. "No one is hurting me." And so they left him alone. The trap had worked, but escape was not yet won. Polyphemus, blind now but alert, guarded the entrance, feeling each sheep as it passed, searching for men clinging beneath. Odysseus, ever cunning, tied his men beneath the bellies of the animals. They slipped out in silence, covered in wool and fear. At last, they reached the shore, breathless and alive. The ships were ready. The sea waited. They boarded quickly. But pride, always near, rose again. As they rowed away, Odysseus could not remain quiet. He shouted back his name, his title, his triumph. The Cyclops turned toward the sound, and the curse came swiftly. He called upon Poseidon, his father, to punish the man who had tricked and blinded him. He asked the god of the sea to delay Odysseus's return, to bring storms and suffering, to ensure the journey would be long and marked by loss. Odysseus, hearing this, felt the weight of his choice. He had escaped the cave, but he had awoken something greater than a giant's wrath. The waves stirred as if listening. The winds paused, waiting. The gods had heard. His men said nothing. They rowed harder, faster, eyes locked on the open sea. They had survived by cleverness, but at a price not yet understood. In the days that followed, the sun shone, but the air felt colder. The laughter faded again. The name of Poseidon began to appear more in their prayers, more in their fears. Odysseus stood alone at the stern, the horizon steady ahead. He did not regret sparing his men. He did not regret fighting for their lives. But the voice of the Cyclops echoed still. The gods were no longer distant watchers. They were now part of the journey, shaping its path with favor or fury. This was not a voyage home anymore. It was a proving. Each stop would test not only strength or wit, but also resolve, humility, and the memory of purpose. He looked at his men, survivors not of war, but of something more ancient, raw power. Blind vengeance, divine attention. They would face worse, he knew, but they would face it together. And somewhere, far beyond sight, Ithaca still waited. A home not forgotten. A promise not yet broken. The sea would carry them, curse or not. Because now, turning back was no longer possible. Chapter 4. The wind that went wrong. The sea had calmed, its surface a mirror beneath a silver sky. After days of hard sailing, the crew reached a strange island, one that seemed wrapped in cloud and motion. Its cliffs breathed air like sighs, and the sky above twisted with shifting winds. Here lived Aeolus, keeper of the winds, a god not of storms, but of direction. Odysseus approached with caution, but also hope. For once, the gods did not strike, they welcomed. Aeolus listened to Odysseus's tale, the war, the wanderings, the losses. He saw a man not seeking glory, but return. And so, he gave a gift, a leather bag, tight and strong, sealed with silver cord. Inside it, all the winds but one. North, south, east, west, each held back, each controlled. All except the west wind, which would guide them home. One wind to carry them, the others locked away. Aeolus warned, Do not open it. Protect it. Trust it. Ithaca lay just ahead, if only they stayed the course. Odysseus thanked him deeply. The gift was a map without ink, a compass without needle. He guarded it with care, kept it close at all times. As they left the island, the skies stayed clear. The ship danced over waves. Days passed, and the horizon began to shift familiar hills. The scent of land, birds flying inland instead of out. Home was near. So near, he could almost see it. Odysseus did not sleep for long, but exhaustion won eventually. With Ithaca only hours away, he lay down beside the mast, the bag of winds tied securely beside him. His breathing slowed. The sea hummed. Behind him, his crew watched. They saw the bag, saw how closely Odysseus guarded it, saw how his fingers gripped it in sleep, and suspicion took root. Whispers rose among them. What treasure lay inside? Why did their captain hide it? Why did he not share the spoils with those who had followed him through storms and blood? They were tired, hungry, far from home for too long. Trust, once strong, had worn thin. They saw not protection, but secrecy, not guidance, but greed. One reached for the bag. The knot came undone. The cord loosened. In an instant, the winds exploded, roaring, wild, chaotic. They screamed into the sails, tearing them. The ship spun, tossed like driftwood. The west wind, their path home, was drowned by 1,000 others. The sky darkened. The sea rose in fury. Odysseus woke to the sound of his men shouting, the sails flapping madly, the sky above spinning in wild arcs. He reached for the bag, but it was already too late. The winds had escaped. The gift was gone, and with it, Ithaca. When the storm calmed, they were farther than ever before. The shores they had glimpsed were lost, swallowed by distance and regret. Odysseus said nothing. His men said little. What could be spoken now, except the truth, that sometimes the greatest harm does not come from enemies or gods, but from those closest to us, from fear, from jealousy, from the hunger that grows in silence. The betrayal was quiet. There had been no malice, only doubt. But doubt, once seeded, grows fast. He stared at the sky, searching for a sign. The stars had shifted. They would have to begin again. Every mile regained would be a mile relived. Every hope rebuilt from splinters. They returned to Aeolus, desperate, weary, broken, but the god turned them away. You had your chance, he said. The winds answered, the rest is yours. And so they sailed again, without favor, without direction. Not because of wrath or punishment, but because trust, once broken, is not easily mended. Odysseus held the tiller, his jaw set, eyes narrowed against the wind. He did not curse the gods. He did not rage at his men. The sea did not care for such things. It simply moved. He would move with it. He would not abandon them, not even now. But something had shifted. Not in the winds, but in the silence between men. The crew avoided his eyes. The bag, once so tightly held, now sat limp and useless beside the mast. A reminder, a lesson. Ithaca still waited. But now, it lay behind another stretch of water, another series of unknowns. Odysseus knew the way would grow harder. Not because the seas had changed, but because belief had been shaken. And belief, like a sail, must be repaired before it can catch the wind again. The sun dipped low as they pushed forward. The waves softened. Birds returned, circling high above. No storms yet, only a long road back to where they had almost been. He looked at his men not with anger, but with something deeper, understanding this was the cost of leadership. Not just command, but forgiveness. Not just plans, but patience. They would follow him still, but not because of fear, because he would not abandon them, because he still believed. And so, the ship moved forward, slowly, steadily. No magic winds now, only hands on oars, hearts learning to trust again. Chapter 5. Circe's spell. The sea had grown quieter, its waves slow and glassy beneath the late sun. After weeks of aimless wandering, the island rose from the horizon like a vision, green and gold, wrapped in mist. It was beautiful in a way that felt deliberate, as if it had shaped itself to be wanted. High cliffs guarded the shore, but a narrow inlet led to a calm cove where trees bent low over clear water. The air smelled of honey and cedar. Birds sang unfamiliar songs. There was no sign of danger, only invitation. Odysseus ordered his men to stay cautious, though he felt the pull himself. He chose a small scouting party and sent them into the forest. Blades at their sides, eyes alert. Hours passed, then only one returned, running, pale with fear. He spoke of a palace made of polished stone and vines, where a woman had welcomed them, offered food and drink, and sung with a voice that made memory slip away. The men had laughed, eaten, and then become pigs. Odysseus listened, heart heavy. He had seen many strange things, but few as cruel as magic that robs men of themselves. He took his sword, wrapped his cloak tight, and walked alone toward the heart of the island. The trees seemed to watch him. The ground was soft with moss, and the air hummed with distant music. When he reached the palace, it stood open, warm light spilling from its doors. Inside, the woman waited. Circe, she was calm, serene, beautiful. Her eyes held centuries. Her smile promised comfort without questions. She did not rise, did not threaten. She offered wine, food, warmth, a place to rest, a place to forget the sea, the past, the pain. Odysseus did not drink. His voice remained firm. He spoke of his men, of their fate, of her spell. Circe listened, amused but not unkind. She was used to fear or desire, but this man gave neither. She tested him, and he did not break. He had been given help before by Hermes, a herb to resist her charm, but more than that. It was will that kept him whole. She lowered her hand. The spell was lifted. The pigs became men again, confused and ashamed. Circe did not punish the defiance. Instead, she welcomed them. Let them eat, rest, wash. And so they stayed. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. The ship remained anchored, untouched. The men grew strong again. Their skin healed. Their laughter returned. Circe's island gave them everything they needed: food, music, peace. No commands, no danger, no hunger. Many forgot the journey. Some even hoped it would end here. No storms, no gods, just stillness. But Odysseus felt the slow shift. Rest had turned into escape, healing into forgetting. The longer they stayed, the less they remembered why they left. He walked alone, often, along the forest paths, beside the sea. He thought of Penelope, of Telemachus, of Ithaca's stones, its olive trees, its cliffs and winds. He thought of a bed carved into living wood. A promise, a life paused. The island tempted him too. Circe spoke gently, never forced him to remain. But her voice wrapped around his thoughts. What if this was enough? What if the war, the sea, the pain, what if none of it needed to be endured anymore? What if peace was not found in Ithaca, but here? One night, under the stars, he asked Circe, quietly, if she had ever been in love. She smiled but said nothing, only placed her hand on his and told him he had a good heart but a restless one. He could stay, or he could go. She would not stop him. But the sea, she warned, still waited with its trials. The gods were not finished. The next morning, Odysseus gathered his men. They resisted. They argued, but he spoke of home, of memory, of the journey that still mattered. He reminded them who they were, not just soldiers or wanderers, but fathers, sons, brothers. They had been beasts once, yes, but they had returned, not to become lost again in comfort, but to finish what they had started. Circe helped them prepare. She gave maps, advice, warnings. Her spell had ended, not by force, but by choice. The ship was made ready. The wind shifted, soft but steady. As they left the island, she stood on the cliffs, watching. She did not wave. She did not cry. But the island, for a moment, seemed to sigh. Back on the sea, the men were quiet. Each carried the island with them in some way, not as regret, but as a lesson. That even peace can become a prison. That comfort can numb more deeply than pain. Odysseus stood at the helm, gaze fixed ahead. He had not escaped a trap. He had chosen a path, one of hardship, yes, but also of meaning. And so they sailed once more, into uncertainty, into the arms of gods and monsters, but with hearts still burning with the memory of home. Chapter 6. Descent into the Underworld. The sky had turned grey. The sea rolled in long, slow waves as if guiding them towards something not made for light. Odysseus stood at the helm, eyes fixed on the horizon. Circe's final instruction echoed in his mind. Before he could return home, before he could chart the path ahead, he had to go back, not to a place, but to a boundary, a crossing. He must descend, not into danger, into death. The crew rowed in silence, the shore ahead barren and cold. It was not a place for the living, though the living were now entering it. The river ocean curled through the land like a vein. They beached the ship in the shadow of tall, lifeless trees. No birds sang. No breeze stirred the branches. Odysseus stepped ashore first. He carried offerings, black sheep, honey, milk, wine, not for a god, for the dead. They found the place Circe described a low, dark trench where the river met still earth. There Odysseus drew his sword. He dug a shallow pit, poured libations, and let the blood of the sheep spill into the soil. The ground drank it slowly. Then the shadows came. They rose from the earth like smoke, faceless at first, silent, dozens, then hundreds, shades of those who had lived, fought, fallen, men and women, young and old, soldiers, kings, lovers, mothers. Some cried, some reached, some only watched. The air grew heavy. Odysseus held his sword steady. He could not let them drink until the one he sought appeared. Elpenor came first, his own man, young, broken by accident, not war. He had died on Circe's island, unburied, unremembered. His ghost begged for a grave, for rest. Odysseus promised it. A small act, a sacred one. Then the air shifted again. Tiresias appeared, the blind prophet, eyes hollow, yet seeing more than the living ever could. Odysseus stepped back. Tiresias spoke not in riddles, but in truths. He warned of Poseidon's wrath, of trials still ahead, of choices that would cost more than Odysseus yet understood. He told of the cattle of the sun, of the silence that would follow disobedience. He told of a journey that would not end even in Ithaca. That peace, true peace, would only come when the sea itself no longer touched his feet. Odysseus listened, said nothing. The words settled like stone in his chest. Then other shades came. Anticlea, his mother. Her face was thinner, her voice distant but soft. She told of Ithaca, of Penelope's quiet grief, of Telemachus growing into manhood without a father. Odysseus tried to hold her, but his hands passed through her like mist. She smiled and faded. More voices came. Agamemnon, once a king, now a shadow. He spoke of betrayal, of blood spilled in cold rooms. He warned Odysseus to be cautious on his return, that not every welcome would be safe. Achilles appeared too, the great warrior, restless even in death. He admitted the truth. Glory fades. Peace matters more. He would trade all his fame for one more quiet day among the living. Each voice was a thread, weaving together a story Odysseus could no longer ignore. War had taken much, but it would not give back. The ghosts did not blame. They did not beg. They only told the truth, the cost of pride, the pain of memory, the burden of return. As dawn neared, the shadows began to thin. The blood had dried, the ground no longer cold. Odysseus stepped back, sword still drawn, but now heavy in his hand. He had come for direction. He had found reflection. The journey home would not just be about sailing or fighting. It would be about carrying what he had seen, what he had done, into the light. They returned to the ship without a word. The crew looked at him differently, not with fear, with reverence. They had not seen what he saw, but they felt it on his face. The underworld does not leave a mark on the skin. It leaves it on the eyes. The sails rose. The wind returned. The sea opened like a path. Odysseus did not look back. He would bury Elpine. He would avoid the cattle. He would tell no lies to the gods. But he would carry the voices with him, because the dead had spoken not to frighten, but to remind that home is not only a place to reach, it is something to deserve, something to rebuild, not just re-enter. And he was not the same man who left Ithaca, nor was he the man who tricked the Cyclops, or who lay beside Circe, or who watched his crew eat the Lotus and forget their names. He was now a man who had heard the dead speak, and he would never again sail without listening. Chapter 7. Songs on the Wind. The wind blew soft that morning, barely stirring the sea. The sky held no clouds, only the pale shimmer of distant sunlight. Odysseus stood alone at the prow, eyes ahead, silent. The men whispered among themselves, their hands steady on the ropes, but their minds elsewhere. They were nearing the waters where the sirens sang. Circe had warned him. No man had heard their voices and lived to speak of it. Ships dashed on rocks. Men leaped into the sea, smiles on their faces and longing in their eyes. Not from madness, but from desire. Not for love, but for knowledge. The sirens did not promise pleasure. They promised understanding, secrets, the truth beneath the surface of all things, and that Odysseus knew was a deeper temptation than any charm. Before the coast appeared, Odysseus gave his orders. The men were to take wax and mold it into their ears. No song, no whisper, no trace of the sirens' voices would reach them. They would row blind to the sound, deaf to the wind's trickery. But Odysseus, he would listen. He had to. The hunger in him to know, to understand, to hear the forbidden, was stronger than fear. He told his men to bind him to the mast, tight and sure. No matter what he said, no matter how he cried out, they were not to release him. They nodded, unsure, but obeyed. They lashed him with thick ropes, knots pulled tight against the wood. He stood tall, arms stretched back, eyes forward, breath slow. Then the coastline came into view. Low cliffs, jagged and sharp, rising from a sea so still it looked asleep. No birds flew, no fish stirred, only silence, thick and waiting. Then sound, not a song, but the idea of one. It slipped through the air, gentle as wind through grass. At first it barely touched the ear, like a memory returning after years of silence. But then it grew. Voices, not many, but one multiplied, soft, clear, so beautiful it hurt. The sirens sang not with volume, but with truth. They sang of things Odysseus had never spoken aloud, of his hopes, his doubts, the questions that kept him awake beneath stars. They sang of Ithaca, but not the one he knew. They sang of what it could have been, what it might never be again. They whispered secrets of the world, why men suffer, why gods watch, why journeys never end even when they do. Odysseus felt the pull like a current. His chest tightened. Tears pricked his eyes, not from pain, but from the unbearable beauty of it. The sirens called his name, not just Odysseus, but all he had been: son, warrior, husband, father, wanderer. They did not lie. They did not need to. Their truth was sharper than any sword. He cried out to be released. He begged, ordered, promised. His voice broke against the wind, but the men could not hear. They rowed steadily, their faces blank, their ears sealed. Odysseus strained against the ropes, muscles trembling. Every part of him ached to leap into the water, to swim to that shore, to hear the rest of the song, to know, to understand everything that had ever been hidden. But he could not move. The ropes held. And then, as quickly as it came, the sound began to fade. The cliffs passed behind them. The wind picked up again, normal and warm. The ropes loosened. Odysseus sagged against the mast, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. The ache remained not in his body, but in his mind. He had heard something eternal, something that left no mark, but would never leave him. The temptation had not been to die. It had been to know what no man should know, to hold truth so heavy it bends the soul. And yet he had survived, bound but awake. As the ship moved onward, he looked at his men. They had saved him without knowing it. Their silence had been his shield, their deafness, his salvation. They would never understand what he had heard. They would never carry that weight. And perhaps that was mercy. The sea stretched ahead once more. The wind filled the sails. Birds returned. Clouds gathered on the edges of the sky. Life resumed its rhythm. But within Odysseus, something remained quiet, still, a note that had been struck, and now echoed forever. He did not speak of the song, not to his men, not to the gods. It was not meant to be shared. only remembered, only endured. For some knowledge, once heard, cannot be returned. It lives in silence. It lives in longing. And so he sailed on. Chapter 8. Between the Cliffs. The sky was clear, too clear. The sea spread out ahead like a warning, calm but watchful. Odysseus stood at the front of the ship, eyes sharp, hands steady. Circe's words echoed in his mind, heavy with dread. Ahead lay the narrow strait, the passage no sailor wished to face. On one side, Charybdis, the endless maw of the sea, a whirlpool that devoured the waters themselves. On the other, Scylla, 12 feet high, 6 heads, each with rows of teeth sharp enough to snap a man in half. No path was safe. No choice was free of loss. But forward was the only way. The men rowed without knowing what waited. Odysseus had not told them the full truth. He could not. Not out of cruelty, but out of duty. Fear could break even the strongest. Panic could sink them before they even reached the cliffs. He had to carry the weight alone. That was the cost of command. The strait narrowed. The cliffs rose on either side, casting shadows over the sea. The sound changed. It was subtle at first, a low pull beneath the surface. Then came the roar. Distant but constant, Charybdis. The whirlpool stirred beneath the left-hand cliffs, its edges already starting to churn. Water swirled and disappeared into the depths, dragged into the mouth of the earth. The ship tilted slightly. The men felt it and glanced at one another, uncertain. Odysseus gave calm orders. Steady the sails. Tighten the ropes. Keep eyes forward. They obeyed. Trust still held. He steered the ship closer to the right-hand cliffs, toward Scylla. Circe had told him this was the better path, if such a word could even be used. Better to lose a few than all. Better to suffer the pain of knowing than the horror of watching the sea take everything. He knew what was coming, and he hated it. The ship passed between the cliffs. The wind slowed. Time stretched thin. The water beneath turned still and dark. Charybdis gurgled, unseen but felt. Every man leaned toward the right, instinctively pulling away from the void on the left. Then it happened. A shriek cut through the air, sharp, animal, ancient. Then another, and another. 6 heads lunged from the rock above, swift as lightning. Before the crew could react, before weapons could be drawn, 6 men were gone. Lifted into the air, screaming, flailing, snapped up and devoured. Limbs twisted, cries faded. Blood fell like rain into the sea. The ship rocked. The crew froze. Odysseus gripped the helm jaw, locked, eyes wet. He had made the choice. He had known this would happen. Still, it tore through him like fire. He did not speak. He could not. The rest of the men rowed harder. Not from orders none were given, but from instinct. From terror, the ship moved beyond the cliffs, into open water once again. The sky seemed brighter, the air looser. The sound of the whirlpool faded. Behind them, Scylla returned to her perch, waiting. No one spoke for a long time. The sea moved on, unaware of what it had taken. Odysseus sat at the stern, hands limp on the wood. He had survived monsters before. He had escaped traps, storms, betrayal. But this felt different. This was not trickery or fate. This was a decision made with open eyes. He had chosen which way to suffer. He had watched his men die. They did not blame him. They did not even look at him. Grief filled the silence, and yet they still followed, still trusted, because they knew he had not failed. He had led, not with ease, but with the courage to act when no right choice existed. That is what leadership demanded, not perfection, but resolve, not avoidance, but acceptance. Odysseus watched the sea ahead, smooth now, calm again. He knew it would not last. The worst may not be over, but they had passed another trial. Lost much? Yes, but they were still moving, still breathing, still together. The journey home was not about glory, not anymore. It was about endurance, about facing what could not be won and continuing anyway. Scylla and Charybdis had marked them, not only in death but in growth. They were not the same crew who had left Troy. They had seen what the sea could take, and yet they sailed on. Odysseus closed his eyes briefly. He saw their faces, the ones he could not save. He would carry them, not in guilt, but in memory, in purpose. The cliffs faded behind them. The ship sailed forward, toward whatever waited next. Chapter 9. The Island of the Sun. The winds had calmed, but the sea held its breath. After the terror of Scylla and the churning hunger of Charybdis, the crew drifted like survivors rather than sailors. Their faces were pale with loss, their eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on the empty space left by those no longer aboard. Odysseus said little. He too was changed, but silence could not guide a ship, and mourning could not steer. The next island appeared slowly, its shores golden under a high, bright sun. Lush hills rolled gently toward the coast, and in the distance, cattle grazed beneath fruit-heavy trees. It was beautiful, almost peaceful, but Odysseus knew better. Circe had warned him of this place. This was Thrinacia, the island of Helios, the sun god. His cattle, sacred and untouchable, wandered freely. Not one was to be harmed. The gods were watching. Odysseus gathered his men and spoke with the weight of prophecy. He told them of the warning. If they touched the cattle, death would follow. Not from soldiers or storms, but from the gods themselves. The punishment would be swift and total. The men nodded. They understood. They had heard enough of divine wrath. They agreed. They would rest, repair the ship, gather water and fruit, but they would not touch the herds. Not a single hoof would be disturbed. At first all went well. They found a spring, refilled their water stores, and rested under the warm trees. The ship was damaged, but not broken. Time was needed. They waited, and the longer they waited, the hungrier they became. Storms pinned them to the shore, unseasonal and unrelenting. Days passed, then weeks. Supplies ran low. The fruits on the trees were bitter and sparse. Fish avoided the shore. The men grew weak, and hunger, like doubt, does not speak with reason. It creeps in. It festers. Odysseus withdrew from the shore to pray, seeking guidance, strength, perhaps forgiveness for what he feared might come. He climbed to a hilltop and knelt alone, his voice quiet beneath the storm-choked sky. And there, while he begged for wisdom, sleep overcame him. He did not know if it was exhaustion or the will of the gods, but his eyes closed. His guard fell. While he slept, the men spoke, starving, afraid, and bitter. Eurylochus, long uneasy with Odysseus's caution, stood before them and offered a choice. He did not deny the warning. He acknowledged the risk. But what kind of life was this? He asked, waiting for death, shrinking from the gods, dying of hunger on sacred ground. Better to eat and face punishment than to waste away doing nothing. The cattle grazed nearby, fat and slow. Their eyes were calm. Their bells rang gently in the warm air. The men decided. They chose to live, if only for one more day. They slaughtered the cattle quickly, almost reverently. They cooked the meat, sang quiet songs, and feasted. The smell rose into the air. The smoke drifted upward. The sky did not change. The wind remained still. For a moment, they believed they had escaped judgment. When Odysseus returned, the fire was already low. Bones scattered the earth. His heart sank. The men tried to explain. They begged, blamed hunger, blamed fate. He said nothing. There were no words left. Only the sea and what it would now bring. That night, strange signs filled the air. The hides of the slain cattle twitched where they lay. The meat on the spit bellowed like live beasts. The gods had seen. The sun itself seemed to glare with fury. When the storm finally broke, it came with vengeance. They sailed at last, but the sea had changed. The sky darkened. Clouds stacked in violent towers. Thunder cracked across the waves. Lightning tore through the sails. The wind turned wild, not driving them forward, but ripping them apart. The ship groaned under the weight of divine rage. One bolt struck the masts. Flames danced. The hull split. The ocean opened its arms. Odysseus shouted, tried to gather his men, but it was too late. The sea had come to reclaim what was stolen. One by one, they were taken, pulled beneath the waves, swallowed by the silence. He clung to the mast, lashed himself to the remains. The wreckage drifted through the chaos, carried by currents unknown. The storm did not follow him. It had done its work. He was alone. For days he drifted, no ship, no crew. Only memories, heavy as anchors. The promise he had made to them to bring them home lay broken. He had warned them. They had chosen, but still he bore the weight. He did not know where the sea would take him, only that it would. It always did. The gods, cruel or kind, had spared him again, not as a gift, but as a burden. To live on, to remember. The island of the sun faded behind him, swallowed by distance. The cattle, untouched now, grazed once more in perfect peace. The sun burned brighter, not as warmth, but as judgment. The journey was not over, but it had changed. He was no longer a captain. He was a witness. And still, somewhere beyond the endless water, Ithaca waited. He would return, not as the man who left, nor the warrior of Troy, nor the clever trickster of the Cyclops cave, but as the one who survived, the one who watched his choices carry others to death, the one who listened too late, spoke too early, slept when he should have stood guard. The sea moved on, and so did he. Chapter 10. The Last Raft. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction. A vast, silent field of blue and grey. No ship, no sail, no crew, only a man and the remains of what once carried him. Odysseus floated on a broken raft, lashed together from what the storm had spared. Salt clung to his skin. His lips were cracked. His hands were raw. The sun passed overhead each day, and the stars watched each night, but they offered no path, no voice. He had never felt smaller, not even in war, not even when facing monsters, because now there was no one left to lead, no one to protect, no one to hear him, only the sea and the thoughts that would not leave. The raft creaked quietly. It was barely more than driftwood. It held him above the waves, but not beyond reach. Every wave could be the one to end the journey. Every gust of wind could break it apart, and yet he stayed afloat, not by strength, by something softer, harder to name. He thought of Ithaca, not as a place now, but as a feeling, a thread pulling him forward through nothingness. He saw the cliffs in his mind, the narrow paths winding up toward olive groves. He heard the wind in the trees, the sound of sheep bells in the distance. He imagined Penelope weaving, unweaving, weaving again, waiting. He did not know if she still lived. He did not know if his home still stood. But the belief, fragile, stubborn, steady, remained. That was all he had now. Not weapons, not wit, only faith. The sea was no longer a battlefield. It did not rage or punish. It only moved, indifferent, slow. A mirror. Odysseus looked into it and saw himself not as the man he had tried to be, but as the man he had become. He saw each failure, each loss, each time his pride had cost more than he could bear. He saw the faces of his crew, one by one. He had led them through storms, past gods and monsters, into battles no man should survive. And now none of them remained. Their names floated on the wind, but their voices had fallen silent. He had outlived them all, not as a reward, but as a weight. Survival was not victory, not anymore. He remembered Troy, not in fire or glory, but in silence. The quiet after the city had fallen. The ruins, the dust, the screams that had already faded by the time the sun rose. He had stood among the ashes then, thinking the war was over, that the hardest part had ended. He had been wrong. The real war was not with swords. It was with the journey back, with the pull between who he had been and who he now had to be. The sea had not tried to kill him. It had tried to change him. And in many ways, it had succeeded. Time passed without shape. He slept in moments, drank rain when it fell, ate little. His body weakened, but his mind stayed sharp. Perhaps too sharp. Memory did not fade here, it sharpened. He thought of Telemachus, the son he had barely known. A boy when he left. Perhaps a man now. Did he remember his father's face? Or only stories, told in fragments? Was he angry? Or did he believe? And Penelope, what did she dream about at night? Did she still believe he would return? Or had she laid that hope down gently, folded it like a worn garment, and hidden it away? Odysseus did not blame her either way. Time changes even the strongest faith. But for him, it was all that remained. That thread, thin and trembling, tied him to life. Sometimes he spoke aloud, not to the gods, but to the sky. Not in prayer, but in conversation. He did not ask for rescue, only for time. Time to keep going, to reach something, to deserve what waited, if anything still did. The sea did not answer, but it listened. Then, one morning, the sky changed. It was small at first, a shift in the clouds, a whisper in the air. The waves began to roll with purpose. A bird passed overhead. Then another. Land was near. The raft creaked beneath him, groaning, but still holding. He sat upright, heart slow but firm. His arms shook as he rowed with what driftwood remained. Each push through the water was a decision. To continue, to believe, to hold fast. And as the sun climbed higher, the outline of a distant shore emerged. It was not Ithaca, not yet, but it was earth, trees, sand, shelter, and perhaps, beyond it, another step closer to home. Odysseus did not smile. He did not cheer. He only kept moving. The sea behind him had taken so much, but it had given one thing back, a mirror. He had seen himself in it. Not a hero, not a legend, a man. Flawed, exhausted, but enduring. The raft drifted forward, pulled by a current that felt, for once, like grace. The gods had not saved him, but neither had they ended him. The choice to continue had always been his. He would reach land. He would walk again. He would carry the memory of every man he lost, every mistake he made, and every dream he still held. And when he finally stood on the soil of Ithaca, whether alone or welcomed, he would be ready. Not because the sea had spared him, but because he had not let it take who he was. Faith in the unseen, in the distant, in the still. That had been his last sail, his final mast, the invisible rope that held his broken raft together. And it had not broken. Not yet, not ever. Chapter 11. The Olive Tree's Shadow. He did not arrive with trumpets. No shouts greeted him. No arms opened wide. Odysseus stepped onto Ithaca's shore in silence, wrapped in rags, bent by time and distance. The sand beneath his feet was familiar, but the island did not feel the same. It had grown without him, changed without asking. The cliffs still stood. The trees still whispered in the wind, but everything else seemed quieter, more cautious. He did not call his name into the air. He knew better. Ithaca was not a home to be entered. It was a truth to be earned. The gods, careful this time, had sent him help. Athena had touched him with shadow. His back was curved, his beard long and grey. His eyes, sharp as ever, were hidden behind the wear of travel. No one would see him for who he was, and that was the point. The final test was not one of strength or cleverness. It was of patience, of restraint. He made his way inland slowly, leaning on a staff. Along the paths, he saw shepherds, traders, travelers. No one gave him a second glance. That suited him. He stopped at a hut, old, simple, worn by time. Inside was a man tending pigs, his face lined and honest. Eumaeus, a servant still loyal to the absent king. Odysseus watched him closely, listened to his words. There was love still here, loyalty that time had not erased. Eumaeus spoke of Penelope, of her sorrow, her strength, of Telemachus, now grown, restless, bold, and of the suitors who had come, not for service or justice, but for power. They filled the halls of the palace, drank its wine, plotted its future, all while the true king lay hidden in plain sight. Odysseus revealed himself only to a few. To Telemachus first, the boy he had left behind, now a man. At first, disbelief, then anger, then tears. They embraced quietly, father and son, years lost between them. No speeches, no long explanations, just the quiet understanding that something broken had begun to mend. Together they planned, no grand assault, no army, only patience and timing. Odysseus returned to the palace not as a king, but as a beggar. He moved among the suitors, watched them laugh, demand, boast. They tossed scraps at him, spat at his feet. And he endured, each insult a thread in a trap he was weaving. He spoke little, watched everything. Penelope moved through the halls like a shadow. Her beauty had not faded, but it had changed. Softer now, sadder. She smiled rarely. She answered every suitor with clever delay. She wove each day and unwove each night. Her silence was her resistance. Her patience, her armor. Odysseus watched her from a distance. His heart twisted. He wanted to speak, to run to her, to hold her, but he did not. She had waited this long. She would deserve truth, not just hope. The test came quietly. A contest. Penelope, exhausted by years of pressure, offered a final challenge. A bow, Odysseus's bow. Massive, stiff, impossible to bend. Whoever could string it and shoot it through 12 axe heads would win her hand. Each suitor tried. Each failed. The bow refused them. Then the beggar stepped forward. They mocked him, laughed. But Penelope watched, her eyes narrow, heart still. Odysseus took the bow. In his hands, it remembered. The string pulled back. The arrow flew true. Silence fell. In that moment, everything changed. The disguise dropped. The king stood, revealed. The room turned to chaos. With Telemachus at his side, Odysseus struck, not with madness, but with purpose. One by one, the suitors fell. The halls were cleansed, not with rage, but with justice. When it was done, he stood in the empty room. The smell of smoke, the weight of return. He was home, but not yet whole. One task remained. Penelope entered. She saw the man, heard his voice, but still she hesitated. Could love survive so much distance? Could a heart still know after so many years? She tested him, quiet and sharp. She asked about their bed, not just its shape, but its roots. And he answered, the bed was carved into a living olive tree, its trunk unmovable, its roots deep beneath the stone. No stranger could know, only the man who built it, only the man who shared it. Penelope's breath caught. Her eyes filled. The truth had come, not in words, but in roots, in the shadow of something living, something that had endured. She ran to him, not as a queen, as a wife, as a woman who had waited, who had hoped, who had believed in the silence. They held each other under the olive tree. No more tests. No more masks. Just a people who had survived everything time and gods could throw at them. Odysseus was home. Not because he stepped onto Ithacan soil, but because he had been seen, known, loved. And under the shadow of that ancient tree, the past was forgiven. The future, uncertain. But for now, peace. Not in triumph, in recognition. Chapter 12. A bed that does not move. The great hall was still. The bodies were gone. The suitors' voices had fallen silent, and the blood had been scrubbed from the floor. Torches burned low on the walls, flickering gently against stone. It was over, at least on the surface. But peace is never declared by victory alone. Sometimes it waits for a smaller moment, a quiet one. Odysseus stood outside the chamber where Penelope rested. He had faced monsters, storms, gods, and the edge of death. He had escaped fire and whirlpool, spells and shadows. But this was the hardest step of all. not because he feared rejection, but because what he had longed for most was no longer a place or a throne or even safety. It was this moment, to be seen, truly seen. Inside, Penelope waited. She had heard the sounds. She had seen the signs. Servants whispered. Telemachus had spoken. Even the bow had told a truth few could deny. But still, she could not believe blindly. Belief was not something she had lost. It was something she had guarded, and now, to give it again meant risking everything she had protected. He entered slowly. The room was dim, the hearth glowing red with fading embers. She sat upright, her eyes calm, unreadable, not wide with shock or flooded with tears. Her face held stillness, not joy. Odysseus stopped a few steps away. His cloak was torn, his hands scarred, his beard grayer than when he had left. But his eyes, they were the same. She greeted him with formality, as one might greet a traveler or a guest. Her voice did not tremble. She asked no questions. He told her stories, pieces of what had happened. He named places and people, spoke of trials and dangers and nights without stars. She listened. Her face did not change. She had learned long ago that stories could be dressed like men strong, noble, convincing, but not always true. Then she tested him, not with accusation, not with anger, with a gesture. She ordered a servant to move his bed, to make it ready outside the chamber. A simple act, an ordinary request, but not to him, not to her. Odysseus froze. His voice broke through the quiet, sharp with pain, confusion, disbelief. Move the bed? No one could. It was carved from the trunk of an olive tree, living wood rooted deep into the earth. He had built the room around it, stone laid in careful circles. No one could move it unless they tore it from the ground, unless they broke it apart. He said this not as a protest, but as a truth too deep to be rehearsed. His hands trembled as he spoke, not from fear, but from the rush of memory. He described the bark, the grain, the curve of the headboard. He remembered the scent of the wood when it was fresh. He remembered shaping it, smoothing it, placing the bed in the exact spot where their lives would grow. It was more than furniture. It was their beginning, their root, their anchor. Penelope did not speak at once, but in the silence that followed, something opened. Her breath caught, her eyes filled. She crossed the space between them, slowly, then faster, until her hands reached his face. She touched him, not like someone finding the lost, but like someone returning home. She wept, not from sorrow, but from the soft collapse of tension that had held her for years. She had not allowed herself to believe this moment would come, that the man who left in the night, called by war and fate, would one day stand again in the place he had built. She whispered his name, and he held her, finally, without disguise or burden. They stood there, wrapped in quiet, in warmth, in all the years that had passed without touch. There were no grand declarations, no speeches, only breath, only memory, only a bed that had never moved. Later, they sat beside it. The olive tree still stood strong, its roots still beneath the stone. The bed had waited, like her, like Ithaca. He told her more now, not tales shaped for kings, but truths shared between husband and wife, of fear, of longing, of the times he nearly gave in. She listened, not as a woman hearing myth, but as one who understood the spaces between words. She told him of the palace, the days spent weaving, the nights filled with doubt, of Telemachus and his questions, of the suitors who grew bold, of the thread she had carried alone for so long. There was grief, yes, for lost time, for lost friends, for the years that could not be lived again. But there was also peace, a kind that does not come from safety, but from truth, from recognition. The olive tree swayed gently outside the window, its leaves catching the wind. The same tree that gave wood to their bed, that gave shade to their youth, now watched over their return. Odysseus leaned back, his hand resting on hers. He did not speak of more journeys. Not tonight, not now. He had traveled far, farther than most, but what mattered most was here. This room, this bed, this woman who had known him even when the world no longer did. In the end, it was not the sea that tested him most, not the gods or the monsters. It was her, and not with force, but with faith. Penelope had not chased him. She had waited, not in weakness but in strength, in choice, in quiet defiance of time. And Odysseus, for all his wandering, had returned not just to his land but to himself. A king by name, a warrior by legend. But here, in the room of stone, beside the bed carved into the earth, he was simply hers, and that was enough.